In the spring of 1851, at a women's rights convention in Akron, Ohio, a tall woman in a gray dress and white turban stood up and walked to the front of the room. The convention was in trouble. Clergy in the audience had been speaking against women's suffrage for most of the morning, arguing that women were too weak, too delicate, too intellectually limited for the full exercise of citizenship. The women on the organizing committee had spent the previous day debating whether to let this particular speaker take the floor at all. They were afraid. The cause of women's rights was fragile. The audience was hostile in parts. And this woman, formerly enslaved, self-educated, African-American in a room that was mostly white, was, they feared, a complication the movement could not afford. She spoke anyway. What she said in that speech has been paraphrased and simplified and misquoted in so many versions that the original is almost unrecoverable. But what she did in that room is clear from every account that survives. She named, with a directness and a specificity and a completely unmanaged authority, every way in which the arguments against women's dignity had been tested against her own body and found empty. She had plowed fields. She had worked in the cold. She had borne children and watched them sold away from her. She had survived everything the century could do to a human body, and she was standing in that room, upright, speaking in her own voice, answering the men who said women were too fragile with the evidence of her own existence. Ain't I a woman? Not a rhetorical question, a demand. A demand that the room look at who was standing in it and reckon with what they saw. A person, a full person, not the delicate creature of the clergy's argument, not the inferior intellect of the philosopher's hierarchy. A human being who had carried everything the world had thrown at her and was still here, still speaking, still refusing, with a completeness and a fury and a grace that no account of the speech fails to register, to be made smaller than she was. She had been trying to make that demand her entire life. She would spend the rest of it insisting on the same thing. And what she understood about identity, about authority, about what it actually takes to carry your full self into rooms that have decided in advance what you are, is what every person who has ever been assigned a diminished version of themselves by a world that needed them smaller has needed to hear. There is a specific kind of diminishment that most people in midlife have learned to navigate, and that they have learned, for the most part, to manage rather than resist. The room that has already decided what you are before you open your mouth. The meeting where the authority you have earned is read differently because of the body it arrives in. The conversation where you are performing a version of yourself, smaller, more accommodating, less fully present than the full reality of who you are, because the full reality has been, in enough previous rooms, too expensive to bring. The professional context where you have learned, over years, the specific calibrations required. How much certainty is acceptable? How much space is available? How loud is too loud? How present is too present for a person of your category in a room organized around a different default? This is not paranoia. It is pattern recognition. It is the learned intelligence of a person who has paid, enough times, the cost of bringing themselves fully into spaces that were not designed for them, and who has developed, in response, the specific, efficient, profoundly exhausting skill of managing the presentation of themselves to match what the room can receive. Sojourner Truth did not have this skill. Or rather, she had the intelligence, she had the pattern recognition, she had the long and painful education in what the world would do to a person who did not manage the presentation carefully enough. She had all of that, and she refused it, not from naivety, from the specific, philosophically grounded, hard-won conviction that the management, the performance of the smaller self that the room required, was itself the violence, that the diminishment the world imposed from outside became, when accepted and internalized and performed, something the person did to themselves. And that the only answer to that, the only answer that preserved anything worth preserving, was to carry the full self in any way. Every time. regardless of what the room had decided in advance. She paid for this, repeatedly, throughout her life. She is asking you to consider what you are paying for not doing it. She was born into slavery in Swartkill, New York, around 1797, the property of a Dutch-speaking farmer named Johannes Hardenberg. Her birth name was Isabella Baumfree. She was one of approximately 10 or 12 children. The records are incomplete, the record-keeping having been designed for property rather than persons. Born to James and Elizabeth Baumfree, who were themselves enslaved. She grew up speaking Dutch. She was sold, at approximately 9 years old, at an auction that also included a flock of sheep. The sales separated her from her parents. It was the first of several sales. The second sale went to a man named John Neely, who beat her for not understanding English language instructions she had not been given time to learn. The third sale brought her to John Dumont, in whose household she would spend the next 17 years. She fell in love with a man named Robert, enslaved on a neighboring farm. His owner forbade the relationship and had Robert beaten badly enough that he never recovered fully. She was married instead, by her master's arrangement, to an older enslaved man named Thomas. She bore 5 children. She watched her son Peter sold south, illegally, after New York's emancipation law had technically freed him. She pursued the case, an enslaved black woman in 1827 pursuing legal action in a white court in New York, and won. Her son was returned. This was, as far as the records show, one of the first times in American history that a black woman successfully sued a white man and prevailed. In 1826, 1 year before New York's full emancipation, she walked away from the Dumont farm, carrying her infant daughter and leaving the older children behind. She did not run. She walked. She would later explain the distinction. Running would have been stealing herself. Walking away was simply leaving, which she was morally entitled to do regardless of what the law said. She found shelter with a Quaker family named Van Wagenen, who paid Dumont for her freedom when he came looking for her. She took their name. She began attending Methodist meetings. She began hearing, with the specific, concentrated attention of a person for whom religion was not a social practice, but a survival technology, the arguments about the dignity of the human soul, arguments that mapped, with a precision she recognized immediately, onto the reality she had been living her whole life. In 1843, she received what she described as a call from God. She changed her name to Sojourner Truth, the sojourner who tells the truth, and set out on foot, traveling through the Northeast, speaking about slavery and the dignity of the human being in camp meetings and churches and public halls. She was illiterate. She dictated her autobiography, The Narrative of Sojourner Truth, to Olive Gilbert in 1850. She carried copies of it with her and sold them at her speaking engagements to support herself. She spoke at the Akron Convention in 1851. She traveled to Washington during the Civil War and met Lincoln, who stood to receive her. She worked with the Freedmen's Bureau. She attempted to vote in the 1872 presidential election and was turned away from the polls. She died in 1883 in Battle Creek, Michigan, at approximately 86 years old. She had been free for the last 57 of them. She spent those 57 years doing essentially one thing: standing in rooms and insisting, in the most complete and unmistakable and personally embodied way available to her, on the full humanity of herself and the people the century kept trying to reduce to a category. The philosophy that Sojourner Truth practiced, and it is a philosophy, even if she did not present it in those terms, even if she would not have used that word, is one of what we might call the politics of presence. She understood something that most formal philosophy has underemphasized, and that the lived experience of people who have been systematically diminished has always known: that the most powerful argument for a person's humanity is the person, not the abstraction, not the principle, the specific, physical, fully present, entirely real human being who is standing in the room and refusing to be categorized away. The clergy in Akron were arguing about women in the abstract, about the idea of women, about the philosophical category of feminine incapacity and the theological framework that supported it. Sojourner Truth's answer was not to argue back at the level of abstraction. It was to refuse the abstraction entirely, to make the argument with her body, her hands, her history, the specific, documented, entirely real evidence of her own existence, which could not be reconciled with what they were saying, and which they were therefore required to either engage with honestly or to dismiss, and which she made, by the force of her presence, very difficult to dismiss. "Ain't I a woman?" is not a question about the definition of woman. It is a demand that the room reckon with the actual, specific, embodied person standing in it and account for what they see. It is the philosophical move of grounding the argument in reality rather than in the theory, of insisting that the theory answer to the evidence of the person rather than the person answer to the theory. She did this her entire life, not as a rhetorical strategy, though it was devastatingly effective as one, as the natural expression of a person who had decided, and the decision must have been made consciously, must have been renewed repeatedly, against the full force of a world that gave her every reason to abandon it, that she would not manage her existence into a form that the world found less threatening, that she would carry the full weight of who she was into every room, that she would make the room deal with her, rather than dealing herself down to what the room could comfortably accommodate. The cost of this was real. She was mocked. She was dismissed. Her womanhood was questioned by people who could not reconcile her strength with their definition of femininity. She was told, in various ways, by various institutions and individuals, that she was too much, too loud, too certain, too present, too unmanaged for the space she was trying to occupy. She stayed anyway. She spoke anyway. She was too much anyway. And the rooms that received her, the ones that could not dismiss her, the ones that had to reckon with the full reality of who she was, were changed by it. Now the bridge. Because Sojourner Truth was speaking in a specific historical context, the antebellum United States, the intersection of abolitionism and the early women's suffrage movement. That is not the context most people watching this video are navigating. But here is what has not changed. Every person who has ever been assigned a diminished version of themselves by a room that needed them smaller has faced a version of the choice she faced. Not the same stakes, not the same violence, but the same fundamental question. Do I manage the presentation of myself to match what this room can receive? Or do I carry the full self in and make the room deal with it? The professional meeting where the full weight of your expertise, your certainty, your authority goes undeployed because you have learned, over years, that the full weight is too much for this room. The conversation where you perform a version of yourself, more tentative, more accommodating, more carefully calibrated to what the person across the table can hear, because the full version has been, in enough previous conversations, too expensive to bring. The relationship where you have become expert at fitting yourself into the space available rather than insisting, with the patient, permanent, Sojourner Truth kind of insistence, that the space expand to accommodate who you actually are. She is not asking for a confrontation. She is not asking for the grand, dramatic, publicly visible act of resistance. She is asking for the private, daily, entirely serious decision to stop performing the smaller self that the world keeps asking for, and to begin, in whatever way is available to you in the life you are actually living, to carry the full weight of who you are into the rooms that have been receiving only a portion of it. Here is what Sojourner Truth asks of you, practically, today. First, name the room where you are making yourself smaller. Not all rooms. 1. The professional context, the relationship, the social world, the specific recurring situation in which you have learned to deploy a version of yourself that is measurably less than what you actually are. Where you edit before you speak. Where you arrive having already assessed what is receivable and having left the rest of yourself in the hallway. Name it. Not to feel shame about the management, The management was often rational, often necessary, often the intelligent response to a real and costly threat. To see it clearly, to know, with Sojourner Truth's clarity, the difference between the strategic management of the moment and the long-term cost of a self that has been managed so consistently and for so long that the managing has begun to feel like the truth of who you are. Second, find the question that is yours to ask. Ain't I a woman? Is not a question any committee gave Sojourner Truth permission to ask. She arrived at it through her own experience, her own thinking, her own absolutely direct reckoning with the gap between what the world was saying and what her life had demonstrated. It was hers. It came from her. And it landed with the force it landed with precisely because it was not borrowed, not a talking point, not a framework, not the language of someone else's argument adapted for her use. The language of a person who had thought the thing through for themselves and was saying what they actually knew. What is the question that your life, your specific, particular, fully lived life, has equipped you to ask? The question that only your experience authorizes, that only your combination of knowledge and history and hard-won understanding could produce. The question that the room you are in needs to hear, that you have been carrying privately because you were not sure the room could receive it. Ask it, not all at once, not in every room simultaneously, in one room, in one conversation, in one moment when the question is available and you have been editing it out. Third, practice bringing one withheld thing. This is the daily, unglamorous Sojourner Truth practice, not the grand speech. The one thing you withheld in the last conversation that you could have said, the opinion you edited, the observation you kept back, the certainty you softened into a question because certainty was too much. In the next conversation where it is relevant, bring one of those things. Not everything. The one thing that is most true and most withheld. Say it in the form that your own thinking has produced, rather than the form that the room's comfort requires. And notice what happens, not to the room, but to you, to the specific quality of aliveness and authority that comes from the practice of carrying your full self in rather than sending a carefully managed representative. Fourth, find your community of full presence. Sojourner Truth was most fully herself in the company of people who could receive what she was. The camp meetings, the abolitionist circles, the women's rights conventions where her presence was not merely tolerated but required. She knew the difference between the rooms that needed her to be smaller and the rooms that needed her to be exactly what she was. And she cultivated the second kind with the same deliberateness that she brought to challenging the first. Find yours. The community, the relationship, the conversation in which the full self, the unmanaged, unedited, entirely present version of you, is not too much but exactly enough. Where the weight you carry is not a liability but a contribution. Where who you are, brought fully, makes the room larger rather than more uncomfortable. Cultivate it. Return to it. Let it remind you what it feels like to be entirely present, so that the memory of that feeling makes the managed presence in other rooms recognizable for what it is, and reminds you what you are capable of bringing when you decide to bring it. I want to close with the image I keep returning to when I think about Sojourner Truth. Not the Akron Convention, not the famous speech, not the meeting with Lincoln or the attempt to vote or the decades of speaking in rooms that had not prepared a place for her. The walk. The morning in 1826 when she wrapped her infant daughter in a blanket and walked away from the Dumont farm. Not running, walking, with the specific, unhurried, entirely deliberate quality of a person who has decided that they are leaving and that the manner of the leaving will reflect the dignity of the person doing it. She was not yet Sojourner Truth. She was not yet the speaker who would stand at Akron, the woman who would meet Lincoln, the philosopher of presence who would spend 50 years demanding that rooms reckon with who she was. She was a woman in 1826 with a baby and no resources and the full, terrible knowledge of what the world would do to her if she was caught. She walked anyway, upright, in full daylight. in the manner of a person who knows what she is entitled to even when the law has not yet agreed, in the manner of a person who has decided that the dignity of the act matters, that how you claim yourself matters as much as whether you claim yourself, and that the claim made on your own terms, in your own manner, at the pace that reflects your full awareness of what you are doing, is a different kind of claim than the one made in panic. That walk is the whole philosophy. The willingness to move toward your own freedom in the full light of day, without the permission of the institution that has been deciding you do not have it. The refusal to run, to be frantic, to be diminished even by the fear, in the moment that matters most. The decision that the person walking away from this farm is a person of dignity, and that the walking will reflect it. She spent the next 57 years walking the same way, into every room, with the same unhurried, upright, fully present quality of a person who has decided, and keeps deciding, that the full self is what they are bringing. Here is the question Sojourner Truth leaves us with today. Not from Akron, not from the speech, from the walk, from the woman who decided that the manner of her claiming herself, the dignity of the walk, the refusal to run, the full presence in the act, was as important as the claiming. Where are you sending a managed version of yourself into rooms that need the full one? What are you carrying in the hallway, withheld, edited, calibrated for what the room can receive, that belongs in the room? And what would it mean to walk in the way she walked in 1826? Not frantically, not apologetically, not in the manner of a person who is not sure they are entitled to be there, but upright, in full daylight, in the full reality of who you are. Leave that in the comments, because naming the withheld thing, even briefly, even privately, is the beginning of the practice that Sojourner Truth spent 57 years of freedom embodying. Not the grand speech, the daily, unglamorous, entirely serious decision to carry the full self in, and to keep deciding it every day in every room that tries to receive less. I'll see you in the next one.